I still remember the exact timestamp when everything changed. 9:42 p.m. on a Tuesday night in March. I know the precise time because I sat there staring at my phone screen for 30 straight minutes, watching the comment counter climb like a heart monitor tracking someone's final breath. There was my husband, Matthew Turner, smiling. That calm, self-assured smile he uses in courtrooms when he already knows he's 5 moves ahead. 2 glasses of red wine between him and a woman I had never met in person but recognized instantly, Emily Carter from his litigation team. Her hand rested lightly on his forearm. Not accidental, not distant, intentional. The caption beneath the photo burned into my retinas. Finally, with my actual partner this week. Actual partner, not wife, not Rachel. Not the woman who built a career, a reputation, a life beside him. I didn't comment. I didn't call. I didn't throw my phone across the room or send hysterical voice messages like the version of me he always accused me of becoming when I felt cornered. Instead, I took 3 screenshots, saved them in multiple cloud folders, backed them up on 2 encrypted drives, and forwarded everything to the last person Matthew expected to hear from me that night. Because while he was out there staging his polished little social media performance, he made one critical mistake. He forgot who he married. He forgot that I don't react loudly. I respond strategically. 6 weeks earlier, on a quiet Sunday morning, I had warned him. "If you post another photograph with her," I said calmly, while stirring cream into his coffee. Exactly the way he pretends to prefer it when clients are watching. "I'm done. No drama, no second chances. Just done." He didn't look up from his laptop. "It's just Emily," he dismissed, waving a hand. "You need to relax." But it wasn't just Emily. It hadn't been for months. And at 9:42 p.m., staring at that photo, I realized something devastatingly clear. He wasn't trying to hide anymore. He was daring me. And the quiet woman he thought he could humiliate publicly without consequence, she was about to remind him exactly how cold corporate law becomes when it decides to look backward. I didn't cry. I didn't scream. I hit forward. Subject line: conflict of interest, immediate review required. And then I waited. If you asked people who knew me professionally to describe me, they'd say the same 3 things: controlled, capable. Intimidating, but fair. I'm Rachel Turner, 41 years old, senior marketing director at a mid-sized firm that survives on one thing: trust. Not the fluffy kind people post about on LinkedIn, the real kind. The kind that makes clients sign contracts worth 7 figures and sleep at night believing their name won't end up attached to a scandal. I built my career the hard way. I wasn't born into connections. I didn't marry into money. I grew up watching my mother stretch groceries across 5 days and still smile like she had everything under control. She used to tell me, "If the world won't make space for you, you build your own table." So I did. I learned how to walk into rooms where men talked over women and still leave with the decision in my favor. I learned how to make a boardroom quiet with 1 sentence. I learned how to keep my face neutral while my mind ran through 10 possible outcomes like a chess computer. And then I met Matthew. It was at a charity compliance gala, one of those stiff, overpriced events where people pretend they're there for the cause, but spend most of the night scanning name tags and calculating social value. I wasn't even supposed to be there. My boss had bailed last minute and shoved the invitation into my hand like an inconvenience. "Just represent us," she said. "Smile, network, don't start any wars." I remember walking in wearing a black dress I'd bought on sale and pretending it was effortless. The room smelled like champagne and expensive cologne. Everyone's laugh was too loud, too rehearsed. Matthew was standing near the bar, alone, not performing, not flirting, not hunting, just observing. He looked quiet in a way that felt rare. His suit was tailored but not flashy. No loud watch, no desperate charm. His eyes moved across the room like he was reading people's intentions without needing to ask. I found myself next to him while waiting for a drink, and he nodded once, like he'd already decided I wasn't someone to dismiss. "You look like you'd rather be anywhere else," he said. I let out a short laugh. "Is it that obvious?" He leaned slightly closer, voice calm. "Only to someone who also wants to leave." That was how it started. Not fireworks. Not a cheesy moment. Just two tired adults recognizing each other's exhaustion. We talked about work first, safely. Marketing, litigation, corporate ethics. I made a joke about how people use the word integrity like perfume, spraying it everywhere while still lying through their teeth. Matthew's mouth tilted into something that wasn't quite a smile. "That's the most accurate description of this room I've heard all night." Then I asked what he did. He told me he was in corporate litigation. I remember saying, "So you destroy people with paperwork?" He replied, "Only when they deserve it." And something in that sentence hooked deep. Because I'd spent my whole life watching loud people win. Watching the bold, the arrogant, the shameless take up space and get rewarded for it. Matthew wasn't loud. He was precise. We dated slowly at first. Coffee after work, dinner on Thursdays, long walks where he listened more than he spoke, and somehow that made me talk more than I normally would. He wasn't the kind of man who overwhelmed you with attention. He was the kind who remembered tiny details and used them quietly. The first time I stayed at his place, I woke up to my favorite tea already steeping on the counter, a brand I'd only mentioned once in passing weeks earlier. He didn't announce it, didn't seek credit. It was just there, like a silent statement. I pay attention. That's what I loved about him. And maybe, if I'm being honest, that's what eventually scared me too. We married 2 years later. Small ceremony, minimal drama. I didn't want a spectacle. Matthew didn't either. He stood at the altar with the same calm expression he wore in courtrooms. But when he took my hands, his fingers trembled slightly. That tremble made me believe I was safe. We bought a house that felt like a compromise between our personalities. Clean lines, neutral colors, a quiet street. Something that said stable. Something that said we've made it. For a while, we were good. Not perfect, but good. He supported my career without ego. I supported his long hours without resentment. We hosted dinners with other couples, smiled through small talk, talked privately later about who was fake and who wasn't. But the first cracks weren't dramatic. They were small. Matthew started working later than usual. He always had before, but now there was a different rhythm to it. Not just busy, but distracted. Like his mind kept slipping away mid-conversation. Sometimes he'd come home and go straight to the shower, even if he didn't smell like anything. Sometimes he'd sit at the kitchen island, scrolling through his phone with that distant look, like he was reading something he didn't want me to see. I told myself it was stress. He was in the middle of a major case. High stakes, high pressure. I'd heard him on late-night calls, speaking in that calm, lethal tone. "No, you don't understand. They can't walk away from discovery." So I adapted, like I always do. I made the house quieter. I made dinner simpler. I asked fewer questions. And then Emily's name started appearing. At first, it was harmless. Emily handled the witness prep. Emily's sharp, good instincts. She's new, but she's effective. I remember the way he said her name the first time that made me notice. Not admiration exactly, but a subtle warmth that didn't belong in a professional sentence. And I ignored it because I wasn't the jealous type. I was the rational type. The type that doesn't accuse without proof. The type that believes marriage isn't fragile enough to shatter from a coworker's name. But there were other signs too. Ones I didn't let myself label at the time. He stopped inviting me to certain work events. He started taking calls outside. He began buying duplicate items, an extra phone charger, a second travel toiletry kit, like he was quietly dividing his life into separate compartments. And then there was his family. Matthew's parents weren't cruel, but they were the kind of people who valued appearances, like religion. His mother, Linda, always asked questions that sounded polite, but carried an edge. "How's your work going, Rachel? Still so demanding?" As if being ambitious was something a wife should apologize for. His father, Richard, loved Matthew's calmness, praised it constantly, My son never loses control. And every time he said it, I felt something tighten inside me. Because control can look like strength, but sometimes control is just concealment. Still, I stayed. I stayed because I believed in the life we built. I stayed because I'd seen other marriages crumble from smaller things, and I refused to be one of those women who panicked over shadows. I stayed because Matthew always came home. Until the day he didn't come home the way he used to. Until the day he stopped caring if he left fingerprints. And then came that Tuesday night in March, 9:42 p.m. A photograph, a caption, and the sudden sick clarity that the man I married wasn't just drifting away. He was replacing me, publicly. Looking back now, the warning signs weren't subtle. They were deliberate. I just chose to interpret them generously. The first time I felt it in my body was a Thursday night in January. Matthew came home later than usual, the clock blinking 11:17 p.m. in the kitchen. I was still awake, sitting at the island with my laptop open, pretending to review a campaign proposal I'd already approved. He walked in quietly, too quietly. His tie was loosened, his expression neutral, but there was something different in his posture. Not exhaustion, not irritation, anticipation. "You're up," he said, glancing at the clock like he was calculating whether that was inconvenient. "I had things to finish," I replied. He nodded, then moved toward the sink, rolling up his sleeves. I watched him rinse a wine glass from his briefcase. A wine glass, not a tumbler, not a coffee cup. Crystal. My pulse slowed. "Work event?" I asked, keeping my voice light. "Late strategy session," he said, without turning around. "Emily ordered wine. I didn't want to leave the glass in the office." Emily. There it was again. Casual, smooth, practiced. I didn't push. I never push when I'm gathering information. But that night, when he went upstairs, I opened his calendar. I didn't hack it. I didn't need to. We share everything, or we used to. There was a block from 7 o'clock to 10:30 p.m. Case review. No location. No details. The next week, he mentioned a weekend retreat. "Litigation team building," he said, buttoning his shirt in the mirror. "It's important." "Spouses invited?" I asked, already knowing the answer. "No, it's internal." I smiled. "Of course." He left early Saturday morning. I stood at the doorway, watching him load his overnight bag into the car. It wasn't the usual leather duffel he uses for work trips. It was new, smaller, sleeker. That bag hadn't existed 2 months earlier. I noticed because I notice everything. He kissed my cheek before leaving. His lips lingered half a second too long, not out of affection, but guilt. I've worked in branding long enough to understand subtle messaging. His body was communicating something his mouth wasn't. Sunday afternoon, while he was still gone, I received a text from Melissa. "Are you in Denver too?" My stomach tightened. "Why?" I replied. She sent a screenshot. An Instagram story. Emily's account. A blurred restaurant background. A hand, masculine, holding a wine glass. The caption. "Winning weekends." The sleeve of the suit jacket in the corner of the image, gray. Exactly the shade Matthew wore that morning. I stared at it for a long time. It wasn't proof. It was implication. And implication is a dangerous thing because it forces you to either confront or deny. When he returned that evening, he seemed energized, relaxed. Like someone who'd just come back from something that fed him. "How was the retreat?" I asked. "Productive," he said. "Where'd you eat Saturday night?" He paused. "Not long, but long enough." "Hotel restaurant," he answered, stepping past me. "Must have been nice," I said softly. "It was fine." Fine. That word. The most overused lie in modern marriage. A week later, I found cufflinks in our bathroom. Silver. Expensive. Not his. Matthew owns exactly 3 pairs. I bought 2 of them. These weren't his. They were tucked behind the soap dispenser, hidden. My chest felt hollow when I held them. I didn't confront him. Not yet, because this wasn't about catching him in a cheap lie. This was about understanding the pattern. I placed them back exactly where I found them. And I waited. The shift became undeniable when his phone behavior changed. He used to leave it face up on the counter. Now it was always flipped, screen down. He started taking calls in the garage. One night, around midnight, his phone buzzed while he was showering. I glanced at the screen. Emily Carter, champagne emoji. Good luck tomorrow. My throat tightened. Not because of the emoji, but because of the intimacy hidden in the casualness. You don't send champagne emojis to a married man at midnight unless you've crossed a line, or intend to. The following Sunday morning was when I gave him the warning. The kitchen smelled like bacon, slightly burnt because I'd been distracted. He sat at the counter reviewing documents. I poured his coffee, added cream, stirred slowly. If you post another photograph with Emily, I said evenly, I'm done. No yelling, no fighting, just finished. He didn't look up. Rachel, he sighed like I was exhausting him. It's optics. We work closely. Clients like seeing cohesion. Cohesion? I repeated. Yes. And captions like, actual partner are cohesion? He smiled faintly. You're reading into things. I'm observing, I replied. He leaned back in his chair, finally meeting my eyes. You need to trust me. Trust. The currency I build my entire career on. And the one thing he was quietly eroding. That was 6 weeks before 9:42 p.m. 6 weeks of silence. 6 weeks of watching. 6 weeks of noticing that he no longer hid the proximity. Conference photos where Emily stood too close. Panel discussions where she laughed at his jokes before he finished them. A subtle shift in how colleagues looked at me at events. Not pitying, but curious. Like they knew something I didn't. Or worse, like they were waiting to see how I'd react. And that's what truly began to rot inside me. Not just the suspicion of infidelity, but the public disrespect, the kind that doesn't whisper, the kind that tests how much humiliation you'll tolerate before you snap. Matthew wasn't stupid. He knew exactly what those optics implied. He knew what he was signaling. He was daring me to either ignore it or escalate it. And the night he posted that photograph with the caption, "Finally, with my actual partner this week," he wasn't being careless. He was declaring something. The question wasn't whether he crossed a line. The question was whether I would. At 9:42 p.m., staring at that image, I understood something with terrifying clarity. He thought I would rage. He thought I would scream. He thought I would embarrass myself. Instead, I opened my laptop and I began drafting a message that would never include a single emotional word. Subject line: conflict of interest. Immediate review required. Because if Matthew wanted to turn personal betrayal into a public performance, I was about to turn public performance into legal exposure. The moment everything shifted wasn't when I saw the photograph. It was when I zoomed in. Most people look at scandal and see emotion. I look at structure. I enlarged the image slowly, my fingers steady, even though my pulse wasn't. The restaurant lighting was warm, flattering. Emily was leaning toward him, shoulder angled in. Matthew's posture wasn't defensive. It wasn't distant. It was relaxed, possessive almost. And then I noticed something else. His phone was on the table, unlocked. Screen glowing faintly. On the screen, a document preview. I recognized the formatting instantly. It was from the case. The case he had sworn was airtight. The case he had told me required absolute discretion because optics matter. My chest tightened. Because now this wasn't just emotional betrayal. This was professional contamination. I pulled up the public docket. I didn't need insider access. The case filings were partially available online. The plaintiff, a fintech company out of Austin, had accused Matthew's firm of procedural delay tactics. The litigation had been dragging for months. And Emily? She was listed in one of the recent internal strategy acknowledgments. Not lead counsel, but involved. My breathing slowed. I went back to the photo. Wine glasses. Close proximity. Caption implying partnership. The timestamp of the post aligned almost perfectly with a sealed motion hearing earlier that afternoon. If opposing counsel wanted to imply bias, collusion, improper information exchange, This image was gold. I sat back in my chair. The house was silent except for the faint hum of the refrigerator. Matthew was still out, probably basking in the attention, probably assuming I was home stewing in jealousy. I wasn't. I was connecting dots. The first draft of the email took me 12 minutes. I addressed it to the managing partner at his firm, copied general counsel oversight, attached the screenshots. No accusations, no emotional language, just facts. Publicly visible relationship between litigation team members tied to active case. Caption implying partnership. Timeline overlap with restricted proceedings. Potential reputational exposure. I read it twice. Then I saved it. Didn't send it yet. Because I needed one more thing. Confirmation. Matthew came home around 11:30 p.m. He walked in calm, coat draped over his arm. He saw me sitting at the dining table with my laptop open and didn't flinch. "You're still up?" he asked. I couldn't sleep. He loosened his tie. "Long day." I looked at him carefully. "Did you win?" A small smile tugged at his mouth. "We made progress." "With Emily?" There it was, the smallest tightening of his jaw. "She's part of the team." I stood up slowly and walked toward him. "Is she your actual partner now?" He froze. For the first time in months, I saw something flicker in his eyes. Not guilt. Not shame. Calculation. "You're overreacting," he said quietly. "I asked you not to post. It's a joke." "A joke to who?" "Rachel, you're reading into optics again." Optics. The word he used when he wanted to reduce my instincts to paranoia. I stepped closer. "Did you access case files tonight outside protocol?" His eyes sharpened. "That's a serious accusation." I asked a question. His silence was answer enough. I felt the shift inside me then, the last fragile piece of hope snapping cleanly. Because I wasn't just his wife. I understood compliance. I understood perception. And I understood exactly how dangerous that photograph could become. "Do you know what opposing counsel could do with that image?" I asked quietly. He let out a humorless laugh. "You think anyone cares about Instagram?" "I think juries care about bias." His expression hardened. "You wouldn't." It wasn't a question. It was a challenge. "You think I'd jeopardize your career over a photo?" he continued, stepping closer. "You think I'd burn down my own house because you're insecure?" The word hit like a slap. Insecure after everything I had built. After every event where I stood beside him and smiled while whispers floated around us. "I warned you," I said softly. "And I told you," he replied, voice low and steady. "I won't be controlled." Controlled. That's what he thought this was about. Not respect. Not loyalty. Control. We stood inches apart, breathing the same air. Strangers wearing wedding rings. "Are you sleeping with her?" I asked finally. He didn't answer immediately. He didn't need to. Silence is its own confession. "I'm done with this conversation," he said, and he walked past me. Up the stairs, door closing softly behind him. No shouting, no dramatic scene, just the quiet implosion of a marriage. I stood there for several minutes, staring at the empty hallway. My hands weren't shaking. But something fundamental had shifted. Because his response wasn't defensive. It wasn't remorseful. It was dismissive. He believed I wouldn't act. He believed I'd swallow it. I walked back to the table, opened my laptop. Added one line. "Given the public nature of the attached material and the potential for perceived impropriety, I recommend immediate internal review to mitigate risk exposure." Professional. Neutral. Devastating. I attached the screenshot of the photograph. Attached Emily's LinkedIn profile showing active involvement in the case. Attached the timestamp. And then I hesitated. Not because I doubted, but because I understood the magnitude. Once I sent this, there was no returning to quiet denial, no pretending, no soft reconciliation. This would trigger process, investigation, scrutiny. I thought about my mother's voice. "If the world won't make space for you, build your own table." Matthew had chosen his table, publicly. Now I would build mine. I clicked send. The email whooshed out of my outbox at 12:07 a.m., and in that moment, something terrifyingly calm settled over me. Because this wasn't revenge, it was consequence. And by the time Matthew woke up the next morning, the machinery would already be moving. I slept that night, not peacefully, but deeply. The kind of sleep that comes after a decision has already been made. When I woke up, the house was still quiet. Matthew had already left for the office. No note, no message, no attempt to reopen the conversation. Of course he hadn't. He thought the storm had passed. He thought I'd vented. He didn't know the email had already been received. At 8:16 a.m., my phone vibrated. Unknown number, I answered. Rachel Turner? Yes. This is David Lawson, managing partner at Turner & Hale. We received your correspondence last night. His tone was controlled, polite, but tight. I assumed you would, I replied calmly. There was a pause. You understand the implications of what you've raised? I understand reputational exposure, I said evenly. And I understand how opposing counsel weaponizes perception. Another pause. You're aware your husband is lead counsel on this case. I am. And you're alleging... I'm alleging nothing, I interrupted gently. I'm recommending review. Silence stretched between us. David exhaled slowly. We will be conducting an internal assessment. Of course, I said. And Rachel, this won't stay contained. I don't expect it to. When the call ended, I sat at the kitchen table and let the weight settle. This was real now. There would be meetings, emails, whispers in hallways. Matthew would be pulled into a room and asked questions he couldn't answer with charm. And for the first time in months, I felt something steady return inside me. Not triumph, not satisfaction. Clarity. But clarity doesn't erase pain. It sharpens it. Around noon, Matthew called. Not text, called. I let it ring twice before answering. What did you do? He asked, voice lower than usual. I recommended a review. You sent that to the managing partner? Yes. You're jeopardizing the case. No, I corrected softly. You did that when you decided to blur professional boundaries. He inhaled sharply. You have no proof of anything. I don't need proof, I said. I need optics. You're twisting this. I'm protecting myself. Silence again. Then he changed tactics. Rachel, this doesn't have to escalate. It already has. Withdraw it. I leaned back in my chair. You didn't withdraw the post. That's different. Is it? His voice tightened. You're making this about ego. No, I said quietly. You did. Another long pause. Are you trying to ruin me? He asked finally. The question cut deeper than I expected, because beneath the anger, there was something else. Fear. I'm trying to understand why you thought I would tolerate public humiliation, I answered. That's not what that was. Then what was it, Matthew? He didn't respond. His silence felt heavier now, less confident. I warned you, I said softly. 6 weeks ago, I asked for one boundary, and I told you I wouldn't be controlled. Control again. Always that word. You confuse respect with control, I said. That's the problem. He exhaled through his teeth. You've made this nuclear. No, I replied calmly. I introduced process. He hung up. The afternoon moved slowly after that. At 3:42 p.m., an email notification flashed on my screen. Internal notice. Litigation team. I didn't have access to the content, but I didn't need to. The machinery had started. By early evening, Matthew came home earlier than usual. He didn't slam doors. He didn't yell. He stood in the kitchen, hands braced on the counter. They're conducting a conflict review, he said flatly. I know. They're interviewing Emily, I assumed. They're questioning whether she should be removed from the case. I met his eyes. Should she? His jaw tightened. You've handed opposing counsel ammunition. You handed them the photo. That photo meant nothing. It meant proximity, I said quietly. In law, that's everything. He paced once, then stopped. They asked if I disclosed a personal relationship. And did you? His silence answered again. My chest ached. because hearing him struggle wasn't satisfying. It was devastating. Not because I wanted to save him, but because I finally saw how far this had already gone. "You could have just talked to me," he said. "I did." "You escalated." I warned. His shoulders dropped slightly. For a split second, I saw something vulnerable there, but it vanished just as quickly. "They'll clear this," he said. "Maybe." "And then what?" I didn't answer, because that was the real question. Even if the firm found no formal violation, even if the case continued, even if nothing legally stuck, the marriage had already fractured. That night, I lay awake staring at the ceiling. The house felt different, like a structure that still stood, but with hairline cracks spreading beneath the paint. I replayed the last year in my mind. Every late night, every champagne emoji, every time I dismissed my own instincts because I didn't want to seem insecure. "Am I overreacting?" I whispered to the dark. But the answer had changed. No, I wasn't. I wasn't reacting. I was responding. Still, beneath the strategic calm, there was grief. Grief for the man who once remembered my favorite tea. Grief for the wedding vows spoken in a quiet room. Grief for the version of us that might have survived if he had chosen honesty instead of performance. I rolled onto my side. The space between us in bed felt wider than ever. He wasn't touching me, wasn't reaching. Just lying there, rigid. And in that silence, I asked myself the question I'd been avoiding. If they clear him, if this blows over, can I stay? Because this was never just about Emily. It was about respect. And something inside me had already shifted beyond repair. The firm didn't clear him. Not quickly, and not quietly. 3 days after my email, Matthew stopped coming home at predictable hours. Not because he was with Emily, because he was in conference rooms, under fluorescent lights, answering questions. I didn't need access to internal memos to understand what was happening. Corporate investigations follow a rhythm. First, documentation review, then timeline reconstruction, then interviews. By Thursday afternoon, the rhythm had turned loud enough to reach me. My phone buzzed while I was in a client presentation rehearsal. Unknown number again. "Rachel Turner?" a woman's voice asked. "Yes." "This is Claire Mendoza from Compliance Oversight at Turner & Hale. We'd like to clarify a few details from your submission." I stepped out of the glass conference room and into the hallway. "Of course. We've reviewed the public content you provided. We need to understand your knowledge of the timeline between Mr. Turner and Mrs. Carter." I inhaled slowly. "I have no direct knowledge of professional misconduct," I said carefully. "Only publicly visible proximity and implied partnership during active litigation. Are you aware of any information exchange outside approved channels?" "I am not," I replied truthfully. There was a pause. "Did your husband disclose any personal relationship?" "No." Another pause. "And to your knowledge, was there one?" The question hung between us. I could lie. I could soften. I could protect. Instead, I answered precisely. There was emotional proximity, silence. "Thank you," she said finally. "That's helpful." When the call ended, my hands were cold, because now it wasn't just Matthew being questioned, it was me. That evening, his mother called. Linda rarely called me directly. She preferred subtle commentary at family dinners. "Rachel," she began, her tone tight and brittle, "what exactly have you done?" "I recommended a review," I said evenly. "You've embarrassed him. He embarrassed himself." "You don't understand how hard he's worked for this," she snapped. I let that sit for a second. "I've worked hard too." "That's different," she replied instantly. There it was. The invisible hierarchy. His career, sacred. Mine, optional. "You're his wife," she continued. "You're supposed to protect him." "From consequences?" I asked softly. "You're tearing your marriage apart." "No," I said. "He did that when he posted that photo." A long exhale came through the line. "You've always been too strong," she muttered. I almost laughed. Strong. That word again, used like an accusation. "I'm not destroying anything, Linda," I said quietly. I'm refusing to tolerate public disrespect. She hung up without saying goodbye. An hour later, Matthew's father texted, "This could have been handled privately." I stared at the message for a long time. It was handled privately for 6 weeks until it wasn't. Meanwhile, the firm's investigation deepened. By Monday, rumors were circulating in legal blogs. Not accusations, not headlines, just questions. Lead counsel under internal review amid potential optics conflict. Emily's LinkedIn profile went silent. Her recent posts disappeared. Matthew came home that night looking older. He didn't take off his jacket right away. "They removed her from the case," he said. I held his gaze. "And you?" "They're reviewing my disclosure obligations." "That sounds serious." "It's procedural," he snapped. I tilted my head slightly. "So was my email." His jaw clenched. "They're implying bias. They're protecting the firm. You think this is funny?" "No," I said calmly. "I think it's predictable." He ran a hand through his hair, a gesture I'd rarely seen from him. "They asked if there was a relationship." "And what did you say?" "That it was professional." I let silence answer, because we both knew that wasn't entirely true. He moved closer. "You're enjoying this." The accusation landed flat. "I'm grieving," I said quietly. He froze. "Grieving what?" "The marriage I thought I had." For a split second, his expression cracked. Then it hardened again. "You could have come to me." "I did." "You could have trusted me." "I tried." "You're escalating this beyond repair." "No," I said, my voice steady. "You already did." The next blow came unexpectedly. My own firm scheduled a meeting. Apparently, once you submit compliance concerns to another organization, word travels. "Rachel," my managing director said carefully, "we support ethics, but public entanglements can rebound." "I didn't go public," I replied. "You triggered review." "Yes." "Are we at risk of collateral scrutiny?" The implication stung. "You're asking if I've compromised us?" "I'm asking if this spirals." I met his eyes. I didn't create the spiral. But the truth was, spirals don't care who starts them. They swallow everything in proximity. By midweek, Emily's name was trending quietly in professional circles. A compliance newsletter published a neutral piece about perceived bias in high-stakes litigation. No names. But anyone inside the industry could connect the dots. Matthew stopped sleeping well. I could hear him pacing at night. Once, around 2 a.m., he stood in the doorway of our bedroom. "Rachel," he said quietly. I opened my eyes. "Yes?" "Is this what you wanted?" The question wasn't angry. It was tired. I sat up slowly. "What I wanted was for you to choose your marriage over a performance." "And now?" "Now I want peace." He stared at me for a long moment. "And if this destroys my reputation?" I swallowed. "You gambled it." He flinched slightly at that. The following Friday, the escalation became undeniable. A formal notice was issued within his firm. Temporary reassignment of lead counsel pending internal review. Matthew wasn't fired. He wasn't publicly shamed, but he was sidelined. In corporate law, that's a scar. And Emily? She went on administrative leave. By evening, Matthew's phone wouldn't stop buzzing. Colleagues, friends. One message popped up while he was in the shower. A name I recognized. Marcus Hale, senior partner. "We need to talk about exposure." Exposure. Such a clinical word for something that felt like emotional amputation. That night, Matthew didn't argue. He didn't accuse. He just sat on the edge of the bed, staring at nothing. "You've changed," he said quietly. "No," I replied. "I've stopped pretending." The house felt colder than ever. The silence between us no longer tense, just hollow. The escalation wasn't explosive. It was systematic. Careers don't collapse in one dramatic moment. They erode under scrutiny. And marriages don't shatter from a single photo. They crack from accumulated dismissal. Matthew had thought this was about jealousy, about insecurity, about control. But it wasn't. It was about respect. And respect, once publicly compromised, doesn't regenerate easily. By the end of that week, the investigation wasn't just about optics anymore. It was about disclosure, timeline alignment, perceived impropriety, words that sound sterile but cut deep. And for the first time since 9:42 p.m., I felt something unfamiliar creeping in beneath my control. Not doubt, not regret, but exhaustion. Because escalation takes energy, and I was beginning to feel the cost. The house stopped feeling like a home sometime during the second week of the investigation. It became a waiting room, a place where two people existed in parallel silence, both pretending they weren't calculating damage. Matthew barely spoke unless necessary. When he did, his voice sounded like it belonged in a deposition, controlled, careful, emotionally stripped. One evening, I came home to find him sitting in the dark living room. No lights, no television, just the faint blue glow from the city leaking through the windows. "They're expanding the review," he said without looking at me. "Expanding how?" "They're examining communication logs." My stomach dropped slightly. "Between you and Emily?" "Yes." "And?" He finally turned his head toward me. "They're questioning whether I should have disclosed personal involvement earlier." Personal involvement. The phrase hit differently when spoken aloud. "Was there personal involvement?" I asked quietly. His jaw tightened. "It wasn't physical." But he didn't say no. The air felt thin. "So what was it?" I whispered. He looked exhausted. "It was emotional." There it was. The word neither of us had said clearly until now. Emotional. Not a drunken mistake. Not a one-night lapse. A sustained drift. "How long?" I asked. He didn't answer immediately. "Months." The sound in my chest wasn't a sob. It was something smaller, sharper, like glass settling into place. "Did you love her?" I forced myself to ask. He closed his eyes briefly. "I don't know." That hurt more than yes, because uncertainty meant he'd entertain the possibility. I sat down across from him, the coffee table between us like a border. "I asked you for honesty," I said. "I thought it would pass," he replied quietly. "I thought I could manage it." Manage. Like it was a workload, like I was a variable. "You humiliated me publicly," I said, "and you still thought you could manage it?" His shoulders slumped. "I didn't think you'd escalate." There it was again, his surprise, his miscalculation. He thought I would absorb it. He thought I would remain the composed wife who tolerated subtle disrespect because she valued image. "I wasn't trying to destroy you," I said softly. "But you did." The words hung between us, and that was when the weight hit me fully. This wasn't strategic anymore. This wasn't about optics or compliance or procedure. This was the end of something, and endings don't feel victorious. They feel empty. Later that night, I went upstairs and stood in front of our bedroom mirror. I barely recognized myself. Still composed, still controlled. But my eyes looked older, tired. I thought about the version of me at that charity gala years ago. Sharp, ambitious, hopeful. I thought about the tremble in his fingers when he said his vows. Where did that man go? Or had he always been this person, just quieter about it? My phone buzzed. "Melissa." I almost didn't answer. "Hey," she said gently. "You heard?" "Everyone has." There was no judgment in her tone, just concern. "Are you okay?" she asked. I opened my mouth to say yes. Instead, I whispered, "I don't know." And for the first time since this began, my voice cracked. Not loudly, not dramatically, just enough. "I didn't want it to go this far," I admitted. "I know," she said softly, "but he did." We sat in silence for a moment. "You loved him," she added. "I still do," I said before I could stop myself. And that was the worst part. Loving someone who made you choose between dignity and denial. After the call, I lay in bed alone. Matthew had moved into the guest room 2 nights earlier without announcement. The physical separation felt symbolic. I stared at the ceiling and let the grief finally surface. Not the controlled, rational grief, the raw kind. I cried quietly into my pillow so no one would hear. Not for the investigation, not for the firm, not even for Emily. I cried for the marriage that used to feel steady, for the mornings when he made tea without asking, for the way he used to look at me like I was his equal. Somewhere along the way, That shifted, and I hadn't seen it clearly until it was too late. Around 3 a.m., I walked downstairs for water. But I heard something unexpected. Matthew, crying, softly, from the guest room. The sound stopped me in the hallway. I didn't go in. Because comfort requires trust, and trust was gone. But hearing him broke something inside me too. This wasn't power. This was ruin. The next morning, I received an email from his firm. Formal notice. Matthew Turner to remain temporarily reassigned pending further review. No termination. No exoneration. Suspended in uncertainty. He came downstairs dressed but hollow-eyed. I might lose partnership track, he said quietly. The words felt heavier than any accusation. And if you do? I asked. He looked at me. Was it worth it? The question cut deep. Was it? Was dignity worth this fallout? Was exposure worth watching the man I loved unravel? I didn't answer immediately, because in the dark moment, clarity fades. You question everything. You replay conversations. You imagine alternate paths. If I had ignored the photo, if I had confronted privately again, if I had chosen silence, would we still be intact? Or would the resentment have rotted us slower? I stood there, feeling the full weight of consequence. Not just his, mine. Because escalation changes you too. It hardens you. It strips illusions. And in that stripped down state, I finally admitted something painful. This wasn't about winning. It was about surviving. And survival doesn't always feel strong. Sometimes it feels like standing in the ashes of something you once loved and realizing there's no version of it left to rebuild. Matthew walked past me without another word. The space between us felt irreversible now. Not angry, not explosive, just final. And in that quiet devastation, I understood something terrifying. Even if the investigation ended tomorrow, even if his firm forgave him, even if Emily disappeared completely, our marriage would never return to what it was. Because once respect fractures publicly, it doesn't reseal privately. I stood alone in the kitchen, the coffee machine humming, the morning sun creeping across the floor. And for the first time since 9:42 p.m., I didn't feel strategic. I felt lost. The turning point didn't arrive with an explosion. It arrived with an envelope. 3 weeks into the investigation, Matthew received formal written findings from his firm. He placed the sealed document on the kitchen counter without opening it. I can't, he said quietly. I looked at him. You're a litigator. I argue for other people, he replied, not for myself. The honesty in that sentence felt heavier than anything he'd said so far. I picked up the envelope and handed it back to him. You need to know. His fingers trembled slightly as he broke the seal. He read in silence. His face didn't change at first. Then it did. They weren't terminating him. They weren't disbarring him. But they were issuing formal reprimand for failure to disclose a personal relationship that could be perceived as compromising professional neutrality. Mandatory ethics review. Temporary removal from partnership consideration. And, most telling, permanent removal from that case. Emily's status? Administrative separation from the firm. Voluntary resignation in light of reputational concerns. Matthew exhaled slowly. She resigned, he said. There was no triumph in his voice. Only finality. I waited. There's more, he added, flipping the page. The firm had also flagged the Instagram post as unprofessional conduct, inconsistent with leadership expectations. Public behavior, not private emotion. That's what cost him. He lowered the papers. It's done, he said. Not the investigation, the illusion, the flirtation, the fantasy. Whatever he and Emily had built in emotional secrecy had collapsed under scrutiny. And suddenly, I felt something unexpected. Not relief, not satisfaction, but clarity. The damage had already occurred. The consequence had landed. There was nothing left to escalate. No further move to make. No additional strategy to execute. The machinery had run its course. And now all that remained was us, or what was left of us. Matthew sat down slowly. I didn't think it would go that far, he admitted. I know. I thought I could keep both. Both. The marriage. The emotional validation. The admiration. The ego. I wasn't trying to replace you, he said. You did, I replied quietly. He looked up. I felt invisible, he said. The words startled me. Invisible? I repeated. You're so strong, Rachel, so self-contained, so independent. Sometimes I felt like I was standing next to a wall. The irony almost made me laugh. I spent months feeling invisible, I said, while you showcased someone else. He closed his eyes briefly. I didn't realize how much I needed attention until I got it. And I didn't realize how much I needed respect until you removed it. The room felt still. No more heat. No more rage. Just truth. And truth, when it finally surfaces, is rarely dramatic. It's quiet, heavy, unavoidable. I loved the version of me she reflected back, he said softly. There it was. Not love for her. Love for how she made him feel. Admired. Desired. Centered. And what about the version of you I reflected, I asked. He swallowed. You saw through me. Yes. And that's harder. Silence. For a long moment, we just looked at each other. Two people who once felt aligned, now standing on opposite sides of something irreversible. I don't hate you, I said finally. He blinked. I don't hate you either. But love isn't enough when respect fractures. And I felt it then. The shift. The decision forming quietly inside me. I don't want to live in suspicion, I said. I don't want to live in damage control. He nodded faintly. I know. And I don't want to be married to someone who tests boundaries publicly to see if I'll flinch. His jaw tightened slightly. That wasn't my intention. But it was the result. He looked down at the papers again. So what now? He asked. That was the question we'd both been circling. I walked to the window and stared out at the street. The world was moving normally. Cars passing. Neighbors walking dogs. No one knew that inside this house, a marriage was quietly dissolving. I don't think this is repairable, I said softly. He didn't argue. That was the moment I knew. Because if he had believed we could rebuild, he would have fought harder. Instead, he nodded once. I don't think so either. No shouting. No thrown objects. No dramatic accusations. Just two adults acknowledging reality. I don't regret protecting myself, I added. You shouldn't, he said. I regret that it had to come to that. So do I. The turning point wasn't about winning. It wasn't about his firm. It wasn't about Emily. It was about clarity. Clarity that our marriage had shifted long before the photograph. Clarity that his need for external validation and my intolerance for public disrespect were incompatible. Clarity that neither of us were villains. Just people who drifted. He stood up slowly. I'll speak to an attorney, he said. I nodded. I will too. There was no bitterness in the exchange. Just inevitability. He paused at the doorway. For what it's worth, I never stopped loving you. I met his eyes. But you stopped protecting us. He didn't because he couldn't. And in that quiet admission, the final piece fell into place. The firm had moved on. Emily, but the marriage? That required something neither of us had left. Trust. And without trust, love becomes memory. Divorce, I learned, is quieter than scandal. There were no dramatic court scenes, no public breakdowns, just meetings, signatures. Now they were dismantling ours. The news of his reprimand circulated for a few weeks in legal circles before being replaced by something fresher. Corporate memory is short when reputational damage is contained early. He kept his job, but he didn't regain his standing. Partnership track was under extended review. Clients were reassigned. His name no longer carried the same weight in strategy meetings. People still respected him. They just didn't trust him the same way. And in law, trust is currency. Emily disappeared from public view entirely. No farewell post, no dramatic exit. Just a quiet LinkedIn update months later listing independent consultant with no firm attached. Whatever emotional fantasy they had shared dissolved under professional pressure. That's the thing about relationships built in secrecy. They rarely survive exposure. Our divorce proceedings were clinical. We had a prenup. Ironically, The very structure meant to protect us during love now simplified our separation. No screaming over assets. No dramatic fights over furniture, just numbers. Allocations. Signatures. One afternoon, we sat across from each other in a mediator's office. Neutral walls. Soft lighting. A small bowl of untouched mints on the table. The mediator spoke in a calm, neutral tone. You've both agreed to the outline distribution. Is that correct? Yes, I said. Yes, Matthew echoed. I looked at him. He looked tired. Not defeated. Not bitter. Just older. When we stepped outside afterward, there was an awkward pause on the sidewalk. This is it, he said quietly. Yes. He hesitated. I never meant to make you feel small. I know, I replied. And I never meant to make you feel controlled. I know. That was the tragedy of it. Intent and impact rarely align. We stood there for a moment longer. No dramatic goodbye kiss. No final embrace. Just a shared history settling into memory. Take care of yourself, Rachel, he said. You too. He walked in one direction. I walked in another. And just like that, the life we built together existed only in photographs. But here's what surprised me. The fallout didn't feel like destruction. It felt like clarity. At work, people asked gently if I was okay. I didn't give them details. I didn't need to. My performance didn't suffer. If anything, it sharpened. Because I no longer carried the weight of pretending. At home, the silence shifted. It was no longer tense. It was peaceful. I rearranged the living room, changed the bedding, removed the framed wedding photo from the hallway. Not angrily, just intentionally. His family stopped calling, not out of cruelty, but out of loyalty. And that was fine. Loyalty belongs where it's rooted. Melissa came over one evening with takeout and wine. We sat on the floor, backs against the couch, talking about everything except men. You look lighter, she said at one point. I considered that. Maybe I am. Because here's the truth no one talks about. Public humiliation isn't what breaks you. Silent tolerance does. I tolerated small dismissals for months. I rationalized subtle disrespect. I told myself I was being mature, strategic, above jealousy. But what I was actually doing was shrinking. And when I stopped shrinking, when I drew a boundary and followed through, the fallout hurt, but it also freed me. Matthew texted once, weeks later. I hope you're doing well. I stared at the message for a long time before replying. I am, and I meant it. He didn't try to rekindle anything. He didn't beg. He didn't accuse. We ended not with flames, but with understanding. His reputation was bruised. Mine remained intact. Not because I attacked him, but because I refused to abandon myself. And that distinction matters. People sometimes think strength is loud. It isn't. Strength is sending one email, signing one paper, walking away once, and never looking back. It's been a year since 9:42 p.m. I don't remember the sting anymore, but I remember the clarity. I learned something uncomfortable about love. Love without respect is erosion. Love without boundaries is self-betrayal. And silence isn't always noble. Sometimes it's permission. I don't hate Matthew. I don't hate Emily. I don't even hate the version of myself who tried to rationalize everything. She was just afraid of losing what she built. But here's what I know now. If someone publicly tests your dignity, they are measuring how much you're willing to tolerate. And if you stay quiet too long, you answer that question for them. I didn't destroy my marriage with one email. The marriage was already fractured. I simply refused to pretend otherwise. And in the end, I didn't win. I didn't defeat him. I reclaimed myself. There's a difference. The house feels warmer now. Not because someone new replaced him, but because I no longer feel small inside it. I drink my coffee the way I actually like it. Sweet. Unapologetically. And sometimes, late at night, when my phone lights up, I glance at it without fear, because there's no longer anything to uncover, just peace. And peace, I've learned, is worth more than applause.